I've mentioned encryption in quite a few of the previous videos, but in this video, we're going to take a deep dive into it. In the Comms for Disaster Preparedness video I did, I went into some scenarios and examples where two-way radio communications could prove to be invaluable. So if you've been diligent in your preparedness and you are now in a legitimate survival scenario, there's a good chance that you may not want anyone and everyone with a scanner or radio being able to hear what you're saying or the intel you are sharing with your group. And when you think of radio comms, most people just default to thinking of analog in their head because that's what the overwhelming majority of radio communication is, especially in the recreational world. So how would you go about achieving, avoiding these people listening in on your conversation? Well, earlier analog radios used a technique called scrambling to provide a practical way to add a layer of privacy. Now, this is not really encryption because encryption requires a complex algorithm and scrambling just rearranges the audio signal to make it unintelligible for unintended listeners. Now, the main issue here is that scrambling has several vulnerabilities that can compromise its effectiveness, so it really only provides a basic level of security. These scrambling patterns that are used in the grand scheme of things are relatively simple and can be deciphered with the right equipment and expertise, making it fairly easy to intercept, especially with that older tech versus the current advances we have today. It just makes it much easier to break scrambling codes. So regardless of the GMRS radios you have or don't have, any scanner can monitor any of these channels easily. So if these are the radios you are currently using, just assume anything you say over the air is not only being monitored by someone else, but also being recorded as well, because it just may very well be. Now, a second ago, I just kind of mentioned about how some of these radios had the scrambling feature in it, especially the GMRS radios. And with the advances in technology, it was easier to defeat. However, it's actually much easier to defeat than that because really all you would need to do is get another one of those bubble pack radios, turn the scrambler on or set it to the same code, and voila, it's defeated. You can now listen to all that scrambled audio crystal clear. And further to that, this is technically illegal to use, any sort of scrambling on GMRS anyway, and several manufacturers have discovered the hard way through large fines and orders to remove it from the GMRS radio channels on the FRS/GMRS radios. Now, a lot of these radios also support all these different privacy codes, but I think before we get too into the weeds on what all the privacy code stuff is, let's talk about first why it exists. So per NOAA and the U.S. Census Bureau, the lower 48 states is approximately 3.1 million square miles. Also, 83% of Americans live on 10% of the total available square miles, and 40% of all U.S. citizens live on either the east or west coast of the counties touching the oceans. Based on the issued licenses and just the amount of two-way radio products sold, it's a guess, but keeping numbers round, about 500,000 plus radio operators, whether licensed or unlicensed, are sharing FRS and GMRS radio space in roughly 310,000 square miles. So the problem faced, by these radio manufacturers was how do we possibly allot for 500,000 plus people in relative close proximity, share 22 channels at the same time without interfering with each other? Well, in 1951, Motorola invents the subaudible tone squelch, which they marketed as PL or private line tones to address this exact situation. And it's certainly a cute name that they picked, but regardless of the manufacturers, no matter what they may tell you or how they label their products, there is no privacy, period. Private lines, privacy tones, sub-channels, and any other name they try to label it as, it does not stop people from hearing you. It just stops you from hearing them. Yeah, I know this makes absolutely no sense at all, and that's why I just want to take a second here and help try to clarify things a little bit. So the first thing to do is to explain what these PL tones really are and what they do. So the traditional squelch that we're used to, being a knob or a button or even a menu screen setting, all this is a signal level squelch, meaning no audio will come out of the speaker until a strong enough signal is received. There are also user squelch types. With analog radios, the most common type of user squelch uses encoding called Continuous Tone Coded Squelch System, or CTCSS. If you've gotten your first Belfang radio and you're going through the menu screens, you've heard that, Chinese voice say CTCSS to a point, it reaches nauseum. But this is just defined as being used to reduce the annoyance of listening to other users on these shared channels. So just to reiterate here, it is not that you as the person speaking have any type of privacy, but rather you don't have to listen to anyone on the same frequency. Another common squelch type that is on a lot of radios, especially a lot of the GMRS and FRS radios, only have simple CTCSS functions called tone squelch, and that's often displayed as TSQL on the screen when it's enabled. This means two things. One is, regardless of what you do with your squelch knob or set your RF squelch to, no audio will come out of the speaker unless the tone you selected is embedded in the signal you are receiving. The other thing that it does is when you transmit, whatever tone frequency you have programmed in, gets transmitted with or in your signal to unlock or open the squelch of the other radio that are configured the same way. Now, there is another method to use CTCSS called split tone, and this means you can literally use one tone when you transmit and another for when you receive. This comes into handy when repeater owners are trying to limit who can access the repeater, the capability is something that usually is limited to your higher cost radios. Also, the capability can make it just a little bit more difficult to try to discover your PL tones if anybody's out there trying to use scanning tools to do it. Speaking of the CTCSS tones, another little thing you can do with them is to set your radio to transmit a tone to unlock a repeater or other radio, but leave your receive tone set to 0. When this mode is enabled, there is typically a display on the radio that either reads TN or it'll spell out tone, TONE. And what that means is you can bring up a repeater or unlock a radio squelch, but also hear everyone else regardless of what tones they are running, almost like a promiscuous mode on the digital side. And this is actually really great for GMRS radios, since the repeater channels share the FRS frequencies and the GMRS simplex frequencies. So in this mode, you can easily tell if the frequency is in use, or you're even able to talk to those that aren't using a repeater. Okay, so we got it. CTCSS is an analog squelching system. There's also a digital squelching system called digital code squelch, or DCS, and this has similar use cases, but it is sending a digitally embedded code instead of a subaudible tone. All right, so that was analog. Now we're going to get into digital, and this is really commonplace amongst public safety radios, but it is definitely getting established in preparedness communities as well. The two types of digital encryption we're going to be talking about is AES, which stands for Advanced Encryption Standard, and DES, which stands for Data Encryption Standard. So DES encryption was developed by good old IBM and adopted by the US government in 1977. It had a 56-bit cipher and was quite secure at its inception, but by the 1990s, with the rapid advancement of computers, it just made it possible to overcome DES through sheer brute force. And basically, a computer could now randomly guess the key in less than 24 hours. So, of course, time goes on. This led to the development of a much more secure system, AES, which was officially recognized by the National Institute of Standards and Technology in 2002. So AES is basically available in 3 flavors, 128-bit, 192-bit, or for the most secure, 256-bit. So AES 256, this is the gold standard. It's the only, publicly available cipher approved by the NSA for top secret data storage. And in 2012, this really got, proven because the Edward Snowden leaks showed that the NSA had spent years attempting to break his 256-bit encryption and could not do it. So looking at that, just how secure is AES 256? Well, unless you obtain the encryption key to decrypt the data, it can be considered virtually unbreakable when implemented correctly. According to a calculation by the SSL store, successfully guessing the sequence of 256 ones and zeros that make up a key would likely take millions of years to decrypt, and that is if you were using the combined power of every single computer on Earth. So how this digital encryption works when it's put into practice is that when you as the end user speak into the radio, that's your analog voice going into it. Well, then this is then converted into digital signals. A cryptographic key is generated, and this key is a random sequence of bits used to encrypt and decrypt the data. And then the digital signals are then passed through an AES encryption algorithm, which uses the cryptographic key to transform the digital signal into an encrypted format. So at this point, transmission's going through. Any radio that's out there that doesn't have that encryption key in it, it still receives the data, but it just shows up as random noise or unintelligible data. It can't do anything with it. The receiving radio that has the correct encryption key in it captures the data, and then what happens is it uses the cryptographic key to decrypt the signal back to its original digital form. And then finally, the digital signals are converted back into the analog signals, and you can then hear that original, voice message that came through. And this digital encryption is as advanced as it gets right now. And this is why one of our requirements at RANT is that for all of our radios that we use operationally, they have to be able to support encryption. So I think the preparedness community should really embrace this capability, if for nothing else, just the simple fact that restrictions here in the United States are relatively lax. Now, this doesn't apply to amateur radio because they actually have, under their regulations, prohibited transmissions, and just state that, they prohibit amateur radio users from transmitting messages encoded for the purposes of obscuring their meaning. So this blanket statement from them just effectively prohibits everything from advanced digital encryption to the use of even simple code words with undisclosed meanings. Now, understandably so with this policy, you have to understand why it's there. I mean, it's really meant to preserve the open and non-commercial nature of amateur radio bands, since, for the hobby itself, it really wouldn't be much fun if everybody had, encrypted, indecipherable transmissions and they were just drowning out every attempt at your, casual conversations. But privacy-minded individuals may also see it as an attempt to impede their ability to communicate, essentially without Big Brother listening in. And speaking of Big Brother, there are some absolute validity to these concerns. The FCC published a public enforcement advisory on January 17th, 2021, in response to the January 6th incident at the Capitol. And it stated, the FCC Enforcement Bureau has become aware of discussions on social media platforms suggesting that certain radio services regulated by the Commission may be an alternative to social media platforms for groups to communicate and coordinate future activities. The Bureau recognizes that these services can be used for a wide range of permitted purposes, but they may not be used to commit or facilitate crimes. Specifically, the Bureau reminds amateur licensees that they are prohibited from transmitting communications intended to facilitate a criminal act or messages encoded for the purpose of obscuring their meaning. Likewise, individuals operating radios in the personal radio services, a category that includes CB, FRS, GMRS, and MERS, are prohibited from using those radios in connection with any activity that is against federal, state, or local law. Individuals using radios in the amateur or personal radio services in this manner may be subject to severe penalties, including significant fines, seizures of the offending equipment, and in some cases, criminal prosecution. Now, regardless of your thoughts on the events that transpired that day, the message is clear. The FCC and the US government agencies, they are paying very close attention to encoded or encrypted civilian two-way radio communications, especially those that might relate to illegal activities or perceived, national security concerns. Now, we do not ever advocate for anyone to do anything illegal, but we do want the best of those among us to embrace any technology they can, legally possess and use it to its fullest capability. The military, law enforcement, and other emergency services are exempt, and their use of encrypted radios is common among all these groups, especially among the military and law enforcement side. But here's where we find our loophole. There is another exception for encryption, and that is for businesses. After obtaining the appropriate license, which is not that difficult to obtain, you can use frequencies within the business band, which do allow for encryption. All you need to do is get a business license, navigate some fairly substantial red tape, go figure, pay a few $100 in fees, and then file an online FCC Form 601 to just provide information about your business, the specific frequencies you intend to use, the number of radios that you will operate on the system, the output power of each radio and the antenna type, and then the placement for stationary installations. There are some specific requirements for eligibility, so you will need to confirm that your business meets these requirements before applying. In addition to that, the one thing here is that once this is all established, if your business violates any of the regulations, the punishments will be substantial. So just so you know what the regulations are, so you don't get yourself into trouble. Now, just in case anyone wants to start in on the whole, in an emergency, it doesn't matter if you have a license or not. Yep, I hear you. You're 100% right. I'm not going to argue that with you. But if that's when you were waiting to get your radios out and start utilizing them, then that just means you weren't training with them. So the reality is you won't really be as prepared as well as you could have been or should have been. So clearly I'm a fan of encryption and digital radios capabilities, but there are some vulnerabilities to those radios. For instance, on this channel, we're always looking into radios from an emergency preparedness standpoint. Therefore, it's, good to factor in the fact that there could be a scenario, even though however far-fetched it may seem, where we are concerned with malicious individuals overhearing information that could help them find and victimize us. Obviously, AES 256 encryption or really any of those encryption standards will prevent, even the most tech-savvy criminals from listening into your conversations, and can even stand up to government-level scrutiny if you have that AES 256 capability. However, its first vulnerability is one that no amount of encryption will solve, and that is radio direction finding, or RDF. And this is used to determine the location and movement of a transmitter, and it's not necessary to be able to understand a transmission to determine where it's coming from. So, RDF is often used by the military units to track down and destroy enemies. All you need to do is look at some of the drone footage that's coming out of Ukraine to see this in action. As well as, it's also used by search and rescue organizations to find lost individuals. And even more so, this skill, because it is truly a skill, it isn't even exclusive to trained professionals. This is literally a hobby among a lot of ham radio enthusiasts who conduct these fox hunting competitions to locate hidden transmitters. And RDF, this can be accomplished with a single, directional receiver, or you can use multiple receivers to triangulate a transmitter. And there are even professionals out there that have precise tools that are just specifically designed for this task. And they do that with this spinning directional finding antenna, and they can scan a broad range of frequencies in a 360-degree area. So if you truly believe that there's a risk of someone using RDF to locate you, the best advice that I can give is just to be as erratic as possible. So only transmit your radio in short bursts, move to different locations all the time, and never, ever, ever be predictable. So that's as far as the RDF goes. Now, another vulnerability of encryption is if you look at it from the perspective of being a burglar, and for that, you don't need to smash a window or pick a lock to get into somebody's house. If you just stole the key, you could just let yourself in through the front door. So if someone were to steal or capture one of your radios, or even steal the computer that had been used to program all of your encryption keys, there's a chance that they would now be able to access that key, put in their radios, and decrypt all of your communications. So, the best way to address this, aside from the obvious, physical security means that you could do, is you could just periodically load new keys into the radios to keep them random. But depending on how many radios you're dealing with, that could be a real pain in the ass. So if you wonder how large organizations accomplish this, they use what's called OTAR, which is over-the-air rekeying. The US military adopted this as a standard procedure back in 1988, and then NATO followed suit soon after that, and that has trickled down all through the public safety agencies. Anybody that's using encryption, they randomly update their encryption keys. So the last vulnerability I'm going to get into here with encryption is one that could affect both analog and digital radios, but it's via the means of jamming them. So there have been studies done by both high levels of government and universities, and they have concluded that digital systems are highly susceptible to selective jamming attacks. And this is basically where an attacker could jam specific kinds of traffic, such as encrypted messages or key management traffic. And even scarier, go on to say that jamming attacks are not only feasible, but would also be highly efficient. And then that could really force you to have to utilize unencrypted modes of communications. And this is actually seen in quite commonplace in Mexico by the Mexican drug cartels jamming the police's radios. So I feel that encryption is awesome, and of course I would certainly advocate for its use. But do we really have to be concerned with all those vulnerabilities that I just brought up, especially the jamming one? Probably not. For me, that's way down on my list of concerns, because these issues would really only need to be addressed if we found ourselves up against a highly sophisticated, virtually state-sponsored threat. So with that, I hope you got some good info out of this video and enjoyed watching it. I can never stress enough how important comms should be to your plans, and probably even more important than that is, once again, just getting out there and training with them. So as always, be safe.